Hi, Aisling. Welcome at Private Kitchen. We're very honored to have you in our magazine, and I would like to talk a bit with you about one of your projects called Lioness, the Nicola Adams story, I understood. Can you describe shortly what kind of project it is, and then we can start talking about the music, how you got involved, and how you did the project, etc. But what's the
Yeah.
story about?
So the story is about Olympic and world champion Nicola Adams. She was the
Hmm.
first woman to win gold for boxing at the Olympic Games. She actually won it twice. She's just an incredible woman with an incredible story who, grew up in a community in Leeds and faced a lot of resistance, being also a woman of color, a gay woman, being in boxing, which is a very male dominated sport. So it was really a story of just also human resilience and overcoming all the odds and succeeding against all odds. And the director, Helena Cohen, who is also a young director who is incredibly talented, um, approached me for a phone call about the movie. And when I had seen parts of what the story was about and also really delved into Nicola's story, it just felt like such a powerful narrative in the sense that it really shows the best and the worst of humanity, I guess. It was, there were so many themes in that film that fascinated me. Like, first of all, the obsession that Nicola has for her sport, passion, but also just pure obsession and drive to succeed, to win, to, fight against everybody who's telling her that she won't be able to achieve her dreams. Then, second of all, I found the boxing in itself. So I used to box as well. So I
Uh-huh.
was also completely drawn into the story because of that. Um, Boxing is a very musical sport. If you watch fights and footwork of various fighters, they all have like an own rhythm and
Uh-huh.
an own dance to it. And what I noticed when I was watching clips of Nicola boxing is that, she was a musician in the way that she
Ah.
danced around the ring, and it was just beautiful to watch. And so boxing to me kind of became almost like a modern ballet in a sense that I really wanted to bring into the score and was just inspiring in itself. Like I could hear the rhythms in my head and as she was doing the steps, you kind of imagine an ensemble going along with it. And so this was really intriguing to me. And I thought, okay, what a cool way to score essentially a sports documentary, but in a much more cinematic and universal way because it wasn't just about the sport itself. It was about so much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
So, third of all, there's also a lot of sexism in the sport that has always remained, even unfortunately to this day, that goes across all boxing, all sports, really, many different areas. And this was the first time that female boxing became an actual sport at the
Mm-hmm.
Olympics. And so this was a big deal. And this was something that women had been fighting for absolute years to get the same levels of funding, the same level of respect, the same opportunities to compete in the Olympics for this. So there were so many layers to it that
Mm-hmm.
interested me. And I think, given that the team was also mostly women, in the sense that, Helena, as a director, was facing her own challenges in
Mm-hmm.
entering the industry. And she's been incredibly successful, as incredibly talented. But I think a lot of these resonances hit home for a lot of the people involved in the film. Um, and in composing too. A lot of the cast and crew, kind of resonated with that of like, okay, yeah, these are still hurdles to overcome. And it just added an extra layer of passion in translating that to the screen. So scoring this film was honestly one of those projects where, even days where I was worried I wouldn't be inspired, just watching the women on screen was all the inspiration you needed, all the motivation you needed to just go back and get to work. So I think I've never delved so deep into the details of a project as I did with this film.
What would be an idea to have a look at the scene, or and then start talking about, because I mean, just in the sound that you created in the sound world, does it also reflect what you just said about the film?
One of my goals for this score was to really bring Nicola into the score in a way, so that this would really be her sound. And I think what we discussed with the director also at the beginning is that we wanted to make sure that the music was no less fierce, no less strong, no less powerful than it would have been for anybody else. And we really wanted to give her agency through the score. So I came up with this idea watching her box, where I was like, well, what if we could take some of her musical moments in boxing and actually incorporate them into the score itself? And I made this proposal to the director of like, what if we could convince Nicola to actually come into the studio for a recording session and re-record her, I guess, musical style of boxing. Okay. And we use this as a basis for the score, and we can build like the sound world around it. So the director loved this idea. Luckily, Nicola loved this idea as well, because I wasn't sure she'd be up for it. And we got her into a studio in Leeds where we recorded her basically punching pads in various combinations and various rhythms. So she had some of my music to kind of box to. And it was honestly just like working with a musician. She heard the rhythms perfectly. She wanted to improvise over it. She got all excited about, you know, different combinations and kind of being the drums of the track. It was amazing and hilarious, because there was a terrified sound engineer, well, a very brave sound engineer, because somebody obviously had to pad her, but it's not every day that you've got a world boxing champion throwing punches at you. And it was just a really fun experience, and a really collaborative and creative and inspiring day, because what came out of that, in fact, ended up in the opening titles of the film. It ended up throughout most of the score. I integrated, instead of just, you know, the usual 808 or, you know, drum machine that I would have in it, I had a world boxing champion providing this sample world for me. So that was really, really fun. So yeah, I'd suggest we can take a look at the opening titles of Lioness, which shows how this translated into the score.
In the blue corner from the East Leeds Amateur Boxing Club, Nicola Adams.
When I was a kid, I was happy just looking at the stars, thinking about my destiny. If I had a destiny, can your destiny be changed? I even used to make wishes and wish that one day I'll be able to be in a better place and have everything that I've always wanted. If you haven't come from the kind of place that I've come from, you'll never be able to get to that top high level, because you just haven't got that kind of desire and that drive and determination. You need to have that hunger. And it's just about how much do you want it. was fighting for everything. And I think that was the difference between me and anybody else that was in the room. I always wanted it more than anybody else did. I was fighting to survive.
Really nice to hear and to see what you have done for this film. Or when you were start working on this film, were you also looking at other famous boxing movies? You know, I remember Raging Bull from because also of the sound design, because the punches in that film were quite famous. Or did you particularly didn't want to be involved or influenced by those older movies which were on boxing heroes, etc.?
Yeah, I did a bit, but I think it became quite clear early on that this was really Nicola's story. And so it needed to be very personal and very subjective. You know, it needed to really be her voice, because her voice had been quashed so many times that I didn't want to be another person to superimpose somebody else's experience onto her. And so what was kind of great also is that she had a really strong musical sense herself, and she had a very eclectic musical taste. Like, she loved hip hop music, she loved various, you know, rappers that she was always boxing to, and so it was kind of important to have more of those influences in the score than necessarily looking at other films. It was more looking at her life and yeah, how she would use music in her own life and how we could use that to tell the story.
You had already some music when you recorded her at the studio. You already had some music for her to box on. So she had a kind of rhythm to reflect, to react on in her boxing. And how did the process go further with the director? Did you throw pieces of music to her and did she react, or did it go directly the right direction? You delivered this concept, you know, this using her as a musician.
Yeah. Specifically with the opening titles, for example, it's funny because I always start a project where I write various soundscapes, almost just to have various, you know, demos of different directions, just to see what the director does and doesn't like, just to see what the editor feels comfortable slotting in and editing to. And you always cancel out a few options along the way, and you start narrowing down what it is that is really the heart of the film. With this one, I'd done a bunch of different kind of experiments quite early on. And I remember I did a session with a fantastic cellist I often work with, Philip Johan Tim, in Berlin. He has this enormous pedal board, and I bring in all of the pedals I can find to experiment with. And we create all these different sound design elements of cello through pedals. And so we had this idea also because the film is titled Lioness. You know, Nicola is like this lion pouncing around in this cage, and she's ready to pounce on her prey. But at first, she's kind of just observing, and she's, you know, she's taking it all in, and it's this slow build to killing the prey, essentially. So it was all about the hunt and trying, how do we translate this hunt in the growls of, you know, this quite an animalistic, I guess, primal instinct of, you know, the rage of so many different experiences and traumas in her life as well, but like slowly coming to boiling point. And so we tried to recreate elements of this with the cello by recreating these like real growls and like these really low drones where we detune the cello and then put it through these super dark effects pedals, and it just became this sea of, you know, anger almost, or this sea of like melancholic thoughts. And so these were textures that we started to build on. And then I would, take one of those growls, and then I was like, okay, how do we build the beats around it, and how does that work with the rhythm? And so like one of the main themes of the film, one of the main motifs is actually rhythmic. It's not melodic. It's a rhythm, and it's because of Nicola's punching. So you've got a ta 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 ta, and that's basically like a ta 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 ta.
Exactly, yeah.
That's what it comes from. And I heard that and I was like, oh, cool. And it was literally just from like a clip also of like Nicola boxing. And then I was like, okay, if we take that rhythm, we quantize it into a bar, we put a 4 to the floor kick underneath it. And now we try and put that into the cello and see what kind of rhythmic. So, we were doing like collegno strings, like ta 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 ta. And suddenly it starts to transform into music, and it starts to become a score. And then we added these growls, and so these were elements that were already building before I even started writing proper tracks. And none of this was even to picture at that point.
Okay.
It was just trying to find the actual sound world. And then I got sent the opening titles, and that's where I tried to bring everything together. And we hadn't done the recording session yet, so in the beginning, it was just me boxing very weakly, I must add, compared to what Nicola did.
Yeah, I guess so.
In the studio, and just gathering like friends around me, like, hey, will you come box with me for a second? They're like, what's going on? What are you doing? So this was the first experiment. And actually, the interesting thing is with this film, which is very, very rare, the first opening titles I sent to the director is pretty much how it ended up in the final.
Okay.
Hardly anything changed from that point.
I heard you mentioned also the editor. What kind of role plays the editor in this kind of process? Is he or she also involved? Is he giving feedback?
It varies very much from project to project, but in this project, it was really Helena and Mark, the editor, had worked together quite often, and they were quite a strong team, and just very communicative about what they wanted and very clear. And that was super, super helpful. So we would generally have Zoom meetings, our real life meetings, where we would go through the progress of the score, and it would be the editor, the director, and me discussing everything. So I'd say he had a very big part in this particular project.
And was there also interaction really between editing and composing? Were the editing sometimes adapted to the music, or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because of course I needed him to match the punches, so that occasionally there would be a sequence where it's like the last punch is just before the cut or just after, and it's too frustrating to watch. And I would obviously try everything my end to make everything line up perfectly, but you need to have the help of an editor on that front as well. So yeah, to be fair, I think in most of my projects, the editors have always played a pretty big role, but that's also maybe because there's a lot of rhythmic elements to it, and so the pacing of it is very important.
In the other video, we discussed about the beginning of your career, and you told us about how you got involved in sports documentary. Was this the very first one of the sport that you did?
Yes, this was the very first one of sports. Yeah, and that set off then a sequence
to other sports.
Yeah.
It really sounds like a very, very interesting and good combination, good collaboration between you, director, editor, and the musician in this case, the boxer.
And the team is so important, and I think that really added so much to this project, is that they were just really great people to work with. And you don't always, I've been very, very lucky in all of the projects I've worked on, but I know from others also that you don't always have that privilege. And the fact that we could just get on so well and they were so collaborative and they gave me the freedom to try out these crazy ideas. And, you know, also for Nicola being up to go into studio this was also during COVID, by the way. So it was like a whole nother layer of complications because you had all these restrictions and everyone just really bent over backwards to try and make it the best project it could be. So that also made it so enjoyable to work on. It was just a lot of fun.
Thanks a lot for this interview and talking about this project. It sounds really interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.